Hello and welcome. Every single year, pretty much every Canadian adult has some kind of interaction with one of the most powerful and, let's face it, maybe one of the most misunderstood institutions in the entire country. And a lot of the time, we do it without giving it a second thought. So today we're going to change that. We're going to pull back the curtain and really get to know this organization.
Welcome to my guide on Canada's tax system. We're going to be focusing on the agency that's right at the heart of it all, the Canada Revenue Agency, or as you probably know it, the CRA.
So this really is the big question for our discussion today, isn't it? What is the Canada Revenue Agency, really? And maybe more importantly, what gives it its power? It's not just about defining an acronym, it's about understanding where its authority comes from and how that authority touches the lives of every single person in Canada who earns a dollar or spends one. So let's dig in and find out.
All right, first things first, we're going to start with the institution itself. I mean, it makes sense, right? Before we can get into the nitty-gritty of the rules and the laws, we have to understand the organization that's at the very center of it all. Okay, so what is the CRA? Well, at its most basic level, its job is really a three-part mission. First, and this is the one everyone knows, it's the federal government's main tax collector. Second, it's in charge of administering the laws that Parliament creates around those taxes. And third, and this is a big one that people often overlook, it's also the agency responsible for sending out billions and billions of dollars in benefits and tax credits back to Canadians. It's a two-way street.
The CRA as we know it today didn't just pop into existence. It's got a bit of a history. It all started way back in 1927 as the Department of National Revenue. For a long time, that's what it was. But then, things got interesting around the turn of the century. In 1999, it actually merged with the Customs Agency to become something called the CCRA. The idea was to streamline things. But, well, that didn't last long. Just a few years later, in 2003, they split things up again. The customs part became its own thing, the Canada Border Services Agency, the CBSA, which you've probably heard of. What was left over became a much more focused agency, and in 2005, it got the name we use today, the Canada Revenue Agency.
Now, if you want to get a sense of just how massive this organization is, just look at this number. As of 2024, the CRA employs almost 60,000 people. Let that sink in. That makes it by far the largest federal agency we have in terms of personnel. It's a huge operation, and that number alone gives you a real sense of its incredible reach and, frankly, the immense complexity of the job it has to do. So, how is this giant organization managed? Well, the leadership structure is really designed with accountability in mind. At the top, you have the Minister of National Revenue. Think of them as the political head, the one who answers to Parliament for everything the CRA does. Then you have the Commissioner. This person is basically the CEO, responsible for all the day-to-day management and operations. And then there's a board of management that oversees the whole thing. But here's the really crucial part. That board has absolutely no access to confidential taxpayer information. None. It's a firewall designed to separate the management of the agency from your private, personal data.
Okay, so we have this huge, powerful agency. But where does it get its marching orders from? Well, every organization needs a rule book, an instruction manual. For the CRA, that rulebook is a massive, complex piece of legislation called the Income Tax Act. You can think of it as the blueprint for literally everything the CRA is allowed to do.
And this is a point I really want to stress, because it's so important. The CRA does not make the rules up as it goes along. Its power is given to it, and strictly limited by, the Income Tax Act, which is passed by Parliament. This single act is what defines everything. What counts as income, what you're allowed to deduct, what your obligations are. It is the absolute ultimate source of the CRA's authority. And to give you an idea of how things have changed, just look at this. The very first version of this law, the Income War Tax Act from 1917, was introduced as a temporary measure to help pay for World War I. It was just 6 pages long. 6! Today, the Income Tax Act is a sprawling beast of over 1,400 pages. What does that tell you? It tells a story of a century of economic change, new social programs, and a financial world that has become unbelievably complex. So let's look at a really practical example of the Income Tax Act in action, something that affects almost all of us, the federal tax brackets. This is the core of what we call a progressive tax system. And here's how it works, and this is a key point. You don't pay one single rate on all your income. You pay 15% on the first chunk of your income. Then you only pay the next rate, 20.5%, on the portion of your income that falls into that next bracket. It's not retroactive. This whole structure is laid out directly in that massive act, and it has a direct impact on the take-home pay of millions of Canadians.
All right, so we've got the institution, and we've got its legal blueprint. Now let's get down to brass tacks. What does the CRA actually do day to day? Really, its work can be boiled down to two core functions that you and I see all the time.
First up, the obvious one, collection. But it's way more than just the personal income tax that comes off your paycheck. The CRA is also in charge of collecting income taxes from corporations, the Federal Goods and Services Tax, the GST, and in many provinces, the Harmonized Sales Tax, or HST. On top of that, it also handles what are called excise taxes, which are special taxes on specific goods like gasoline and tobacco. But remember that two-way street I mentioned? Here's the other side of the coin, delivering benefits. The CRA uses the tax system as a massive delivery mechanism for some of Canada's biggest social and economic programs. We're talking about things like the Canada Child Benefit that goes to families, the GST/HST credit that helps those with lower incomes, and even big-ticket items like the SR&ED tax incentives that encourage innovation in business. The CRA is the engine that makes sure all those funds get where they're supposed to go.
Now, whenever you have a system this big and this powerful, one that touches literally every Canadian's life, you have to have checks and balances. You need mechanisms to keep it fair and maintain its integrity. And that brings us to two really important topics, compliance and the appeals process.
You can think of this as a fundamental balancing act. On one side of the scale, the CRA has tools like audits to verify information and make sure the system is working properly, that everyone is paying their fair share. But on the other side of the scale, you, the taxpayer, have a formal, legally protected right to disagree with and dispute the CRA's decisions. And this idea right here is really the bedrock of your rights as a taxpayer in Canada. If you get that notice of assessment in the mail or online, and you look at it and think, wait a minute, this isn't right, you are not at a dead end. The story doesn't end there. You have the power to formally challenge it by filing something called an objection.
So what does that look like? Well, the path is actually very clearly laid out. Step 1, you file that objection. It goes to a special division within the CRA called the Appeals Branch, and they're supposed to give it a fresh, impartial look. Now, what if you're still not satisfied with their decision? Well, the process is not over. At that point, you have the right to take your case completely outside of the CRA and into the court system, starting with the Tax Court of Canada. And from there, it could even be appealed further. It's a multi-layered process designed to give you a fair hearing.
Okay, this brings us to our final section, and honestly, it might be the most important one for you as an individual. We're going to talk about your rights within the system and the different ways the CRA is held accountable to you.
Let's be very clear about something. The Taxpayer Bill of Rights isn't just a nice-sounding mission statement on a website. It outlines your explicit rights. These are entitlements, and some of them are absolutely crucial. You have the right to privacy and confidentiality, the right to get complete and clear information in a timely way, the right to be treated professionally and fairly, and this one is huge. You have the right to file a complaint about service without any fear of reprisal. They can't hold it against you.
So what happens if you feel those rights aren't being respected? Well, to back them up, there's an independent watchdog. It's called the Office of the Taxpayers Ombudsperson. And the key here is that this office operates at arm's length from the CRA, meaning it's independent. If you have a complaint about the service you've received and you feel the CRA just isn't resolving it fairly, the Ombudsperson is your next phone call. It's another critical layer of accountability focused specifically on how you were treated.
So I want to leave you with a final thought, a question to chew on. We've seen that Canada's tax system is anything but static, right? It's grown from a tiny 6-page document into a 1,400-page giant. As our world keeps changing, with the rise of the gig economy, digital currencies, and all sorts of new challenges, how does this delicate balance have to evolve? The balance between the government's legitimate need to collect taxes and your fundamental rights as a citizen to fairness, privacy, and good service. That tension is always going to be there. And how we manage that balance will really define the relationship between Canadians and the CRA for the next generation. It's a question that every single one of us has a stake in. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.